So this morning you may notice that we have a different picture up here. We don't have trees anymore. Anybody else got sick of the trees besides me? Oh, okay, all right, a few of us, all right? Yes, we're starting a new series today, which we're going to run through January 5th, called Get Ready for God to Move. Get ready for God to move. What is that all about? Well, Advent, of course, is the season that we're starting today. That's why everything got dressed up for Christmas, right? Advent means coming. It's a time of preparation for the coming of God. You know, we talk about in that time leading up to Christmas that God had promised to come and dwell among us, that God is Emmanuel, who is God with us, right? And so in Advent, we are preparing for God's coming. And of course, the early Christians who celebrated Advent celebrated first the second coming of Jesus, anticipating what was going to happen, and then turned their faces back toward what happened at Christmas. So are we ready for God to come and dwell among us? Are we ready for Him to do, as He says in Isaiah, a new thing that springs up? So interim is one of those times when we prepare for what God is going to do, His new thing, for God to move. Are we ready for that? Of course, we don't want to confuse the coming of a new pastor with the coming of God. I mean, that kind of sets Him up for a little bit of unrealistic expectations, don't you think? So we don't want to get confused that way, but instead refocusing our attention on what God is really doing to join Him in what He's already up to, right? So let me start us off this morning with this question. How many of us have ever been told to be good because God is watching? Show of hands. Anybody? Okay, most of us, right? Right? Okay. Well, you see, I actually had a friend in college. I had a friend, I guess you could say. But he was always wearing this shirt all around all the time. Jesus is coming. Everybody look busy. It had this sense, right, of hey, the boss is coming. So everybody looked like you're actually getting something done, right? I mean, there was this sense, right? So we have this sense of if we're going to get ready for God to move, this is a matter of kind of just looking busy, like, you know, restacking the paper or whatever we're doing to make it look like we're actually working on something. You know, I always thought that was a little bit of a funny way of looking at it because I didn't feel like I was really loafing around a whole lot in college. I mean, you know, it was pretty busy, but, you know, Jesus is coming, everybody look busy. But, you know, this time of year, though, there is that sense that, you know, are we going to, you know, God is coming, are we going to be ready for it? Which actually led me to another childhood friend of mine named Calvin. I know it's probably a little hard to read for most of us, but it really wasn't going to fit on the slide any other way. So, for those of us who can't read it from your seats, which I couldn't from the back, so don't feel bad. The radio is singing, "He sees you when you're sleeping. He knows when you're awake. He knows if you've been bad or good, so be good for goodness sake." And Calvin turns the radio off. He puts his hands on his hips and he says, "Santa Claus, kindly old elf or CIA spook?" I'm not sure the benefits of associating God with a Santa Claus sort of surveillance. It's often the case for us adults teaching children how to behave, you know, but it instills a fear of God that I wonder is not really aligned with Scripture, right? If this is the kind of getting ready for Jesus that we're all about. I mean, swapping out love for fear doesn't feel like it really reflects that great commandment to love God with heart, soul, mind, and strength and love your neighbor as yourself, right? Swapping out the love of God for this fear that God's going to see what you're up to doesn't really feel like it fits. I mean, fearing the consequences of our behavior lest we get caught by kind of the divine eye in the sky, you know, the heavenly red light camera or the leaked angelic paparazzi photo, often kind of creates this graceless, rule-following legalism based in fear. And that's not really what we're all about here, is it? This is really a sharp contrast to the biblical perspective where we have a loving relationship with a good Father who loves us so much he's willing to set aside his rights, his glory, and his splendor to become like one of us to reconcile us to him. I mean, that's what we're going to look at here as we join around the table, right? That God, in Jesus Christ, left the glory and splendor of heaven, became a human being, died the most horrible death imaginable, and then rose from the dead. That's what we celebrate at the table. That's in contrast to this whole, you better watch out. You better not cry. Better not pout, because I'm telling you why. What? Oh, wait. Is it Santa Claus or is it Jesus, right? I mean, we kind of do that to ourselves, don't we? So I thought that today, perhaps, as we are preparing for new leadership in the congregation, and as we're thinking about preparing for a new pastor to arrive, and as the church season of the year is all about preparing for the arrival of God, the God with us, Emmanuel, it might not be a bad idea to start with looking at how we can be prepared for God to move, despite what might be going on around us. So let's take a quick look at Matthew chapter 24, 36 through 44. So Jesus is in the middle of a sentence or a middle of a long, extended speech, and so we're going to jump in the middle, and then we'll kind of explain the beginning and the end, because we're in the middle. It says, "But about that day or hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, but only the Father. As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. For in the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, up to the day Noah entered the ark. And they knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came and swept them all away. That is how it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken and the other left. 2 women will be grinding at a hand mill, one will be taken and the other left. Therefore keep watch, because you do not know on what day your Lord will come. But understand this, if the owner of the house had known at what time of the night the thief was coming, he would have kept watch and would not have let his house be broken into. So you also must be ready, because the Son of Man will come in an hour when you do not expect him." May God add his blessing and his insight to the reading and the hearing and the doing of his word. So, this is one of those hard passages of the Bible, right? And it's one of those ones where people have taken a lot of time to think about it and talk about it and write about it and work it through and everything else, and it's still a hard passage of the Bible. It's just hard. There are actually a couple of reasons for this if you think about it, just from a kind of an English kind of standpoint, right? I mean, it's a complicated passage in general. The first thing is that Jesus is taking a bunch of biblical examples and he's kind of mashing them all together, right? Okay, we got this thief thing going on here. We've got Noah. We've got people, grinding in a mill. We've got people out in the fields. We've got all this stuff going on kind of all at the same time. And you just kind of thrown it all into this linguistic stew and stirred it around, and we're kind of like, huh? And pretty much for the last 2,000 years, ever since the book of Matthew was written, people have read through this passage and kind of gone, huh? Because Jesus mixes all this stuff together, and we just can't quite really tease it all apart. So he's got this stuff all mixed together. And so it makes following his train of thought a little bit complicated. It's kind of like, you're in the middle of a speech and somebody goes, "Squirrel!" But the second point is that Jesus is in the middle of talking about the future of Jerusalem, and he's talking about it from his perspective before the fall of Jerusalem that happened 40 years after Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. And he is, so like so many of us who look into the future, looking into the future like we're looking through a telescope the wrong way, right? You ever done that? You've looked through a telescope the wrong way, one of those little kids' telescopes? You take the big end and you stick it up there and you try to look out through the small end, what does everything look like? Everything looks really tiny if it's in focus at all. Sometimes it's upside down, depending on your telescope, right? The other thing that happens is that what's in front of something else gets all flattened out. You lose your sense of depth, right? Everything kind of looks flat. And so unless something's just physically right in front of something else, it's really hard to tell distance, right? You're looking through a telescope the wrong way. I don't know, maybe you haven't done this in a while. I've got small children, so guess what? We have telescopes and we do this sort of thing, right? Why is everything so small? Well, turn it around, right? So it's a little hard to tell, Jesus is stacking all this stuff up, and it's like, well, where does this all really fit? And from Jesus' perspective, it's kind of this old flat kind of picture. So pulling this apart, there are some broad brushstrokes of what we can understand, and that's where we're going to work from, because otherwise I'm just sort of going to be making it up as I go, and I don't think that's what you guys want me to do, right? I mean, that doesn't feel good to me, so we're not going to do that part. But pulling it apart, here's some broad brushstrokes, right? So he's got this outline. We're going to start with the fall of Jerusalem. That's something that's very clear. He says, you see these stones? This whole thing is going to fall over. This thing is going to, not one of these is going to be left on another, right? It's like somebody takes these blocks and they literally pry them apart. Not one of them is left on another. That's what he's describing, right? And then he said, the second thing that's there, very thematic, is that it's going to be a really difficult time, maybe even deadly for many people, for everybody who's there. And the third thing that's very clear in there is that at some point in the middle of this difficult and deadly time, the Son of Man's going to show up and put an end to all this difficulty and set everything right. Okay? So those are the three things we can make out. And there's lots of metaphors and lots of descriptive language in here. But Jesus is saying, Jerusalem's going to fall over, or get knocked over. It's going to really, really be difficult, deadly for a lot of people. And the Son of Man's going to show up in the middle of this all and straighten everything out. Those are the three things. So in the chunk of the passage we have here, Jesus talks about the fact that we have to be ready because we don't know when the Son of Man is going to come. And we often look at this as making sure that we're ready for the arrival of the Son of Man. And I think, though, that as we read this, that we're actually needing to look at it in the other way around. Okay? The way we first read this, from our perspective, Jerusalem has fallen close to 2,000 years ago from us, right? And that was a very terrible time for all of Jesus' disciples and everybody in Israel as the Roman army marched in and literally pried the stones apart at the temple so they could get the gold leaf out from in between them, right? And knocked everything down, burnt everything to the ground. So we tend to look at this as get ready because Jesus is coming, because that's the logical next thing, right? Because we've seen 1 and 2, and 3 is the thing that hasn't happened yet. But I think Jesus actually intends us to see it the other way around. So, throughout this passage, Jesus is focusing on how hard it is going to be for the disciples when all of this starts to happen. It's going to be really tough. It's going to be difficult. It could be deadly. Be ready because you don't know. You don't want these times to come upon you unprepared, he says. Things did get very tough. And he says that the tough times will only resolve when the Son of Man comes, and it comes in a way that's not just another rebellion or religious sect. He talks about earlier, he says, if they say he's out in the wilderness, don't go follow him because it's not him. If he says he's over here in this field, or he's over in this building, don't go there because that's not him. It's not going to be him. No, the preparations he invites them to make throughout the passage, the verses before and after this section we're looking at today, tend to make us think that they're heading for a long, protracted war with famine and devastation, and nobody can make any money, nobody has anything to eat, everything's going to be really hard for a really long time. So the preparation, then, is twofold. They need to be prepared to endure difficulty, be ready, because difficulty is coming. Right? He's saying, be prepared, because things are going to get difficult. So do what you have to do to be ready for things to be difficult for a while. That's what he says. Endure the difficulty. That's the first big thing. So they'll have to stick with being faithful to God, even in the midst of everything being really hard. That's something you have to prepare for. I mean, think about it. If you go into something not expecting it to be difficult, and it's more difficult than you expected, how likely are you to stick with it? Right? If you were the kid that walked up to the plate in Little League, and you swung the bat the first time and you hit it out of the park, well, you were pretty unique, right? But if you were the kid that expected that, great. If you were the kid that expected that and then kept swinging and swinging and swinging and swinging and swinging, and never made contact with the ball through an entire season of Little League, and then you discovered you needed glasses. But anyway, if you expected to just hit it out of the park every time, you might go, I'm done, right? So Jesus is saying it will be difficult for the followers of Jesus, so get ready. So if you walk into something expecting it to be difficult, and then it's easier than you expected, well, how does that feel? It feels a lot better, doesn't it? Instead of walking in and going, hey, this was supposed to be easy, now I feel defeated. If you walk in thinking, okay, this is going to be really tough, and I walk out of there, then all of a sudden you feel what? Hey, I just did that. Your whole manner changes, your whole demeanor changes, your shoulders, sit back a little further, right? You're like, hey, I just did that. I just did that. So be prepared to endure the difficulty. The second thing is, God is the source of salvation, and so not us. So we need to be ready for Him to set everything right. So one of the things we often stumble into, right, is that we think, okay, this is so hard, we got to find a way to fix this right now. We got to do it ourselves because nobody else is going to do it for us. And God's promise is the Son of Man is coming because this is so big, it's bigger than us. And so we've got to have God save us. Only God can save. And so this is why he talks about some being taken and others left. Of course, some in war, some are taken into captivity, others being left in the land. This is the experience of displaced and raided peoples throughout history. I mean, I remember about 15 years ago when things were going crazy in Sudan, and I was in a church that had a sister church over there, and people were getting raided out of their villages and dragged away, and some people were left, right? That was their experience. Things were a problem because these were Christian villages and they were trying to oppress those people. Part of the preparations, of course, that Jesus is inviting his people to make is that they must be prepared that, well, some people will be taken away by the invading army. And so one of the things we see then is that Jesus is saying, hey, look, we need to be prepared because we don't know when the Son of Man is coming. And why is that important? Because we don't know how long things are going to be difficult before they get better. That's why we have to keep watch for when the Son of Man shows up. It's not that we have to be standing here on our best behavior. He sees you when you're sleeping. No, it's not that so much. It's that we know that it's going to be hard, and we have no idea when the Son of Man is going to come. And so we have to be ready for it to be hard as long as it's got to be hard. And so when the Son of Man comes, we're ready. We're not saying, oh, it's so hard, we've given up. And then when the Son of Man comes, and then why'd you give up? You didn't think you were coming. Right? We don't want to be there. Or the Son of Man comes, and he goes, what are you doing? And we said, well, this got so bad we decided just to fix it ourselves. He says, no, you're messing it all up, right? You don't want to have that conversation either, right? On Jesus' bad side for trying to fix something and break it worse along the way. I mean, I don't know. It sounds like an amateur plumbing project to me. You got to replace the faucet, and next thing you know, something's sprung loose somewhere else in the house, right? No, Jesus tells us to be ready and to keep watch, because times are going to be difficult. And we don't know when Jesus is returning, but he wants us to be ready to stay the course no matter how long that takes. Hopefully that feels in some ways a little bit better than keep watch, because you never know, he might catch you doing. Right? Because that's not really what Jesus has been saying here through this whole passage. He's not saying, hey, he could catch you doing something untoward and, be ready because Jesus could see you doing something, right? So what do we do to be ready? Since we're looking at this passage and we say, hey, it's important for us to be ready, and things could be difficult, we don't know when Jesus is coming back, but it's important to be ready for him no matter how long it takes him to show up, right? What are ways we can get ready? Well, as I thought about this and thinking about the fact that we are electing leaders or affirming leaders, and it looks like many of those leaders are some of the leaders we've already had, and they're going to be leaders again. Maybe some people in different positions, or some people in the same positions. I thought, well, what are some ways we could be ready, get ourselves ready for what God is up to, whether it's going to be difficult or fun or whatever it may be. And so I'd like to get just downright practical, since the other thing I noticed on our list of leaders is that if I counted across this room, probably over half of you are on this list, right? So there's a lot of you involved in leadership, which is really awesome in a lot of ways. So I think if I talk to the leaders in this room, I'm talking to at least most of us. And if you don't happen to be on this list this year, I'm guessing you will be next year, right? Because you know what? If you're feeling left out, I'm sure somebody would allow you to volunteer to take their place. Right? So let's get downright practical here for a minute. I think there are 7 ways to prepare. 7 basic things. If we're going to be leaders for one another and we're going to be leading the way into what God has for us, there are 7 different things we can do. And I know this graphic got really small, but there are 7 things, and we'll jump into them in a way we can actually read them. So, the first thing is process capacity. And let me jump into it this way. How many of you have ever heard somebody answer the question to, why did we do that? Maybe you've heard somebody answer this way, or maybe you've been the one answering. And the answer is, because we've always done it that way. How many people have not heard that ever before in your lives? Show of hands. Okay. So nobody raise their hands. How many people are sleeping? Okay, all right, just make sure. So the big important thing with process is that we know what we're doing and why we're doing it, and it's connected to a real sense of purpose. So there's plenty of things that people do. I heard this whole story about, a mother and daughter were having this conversation about making the Easter ham, right? And the mother always took the Easter ham out and cut both ends off the ham and stuck it in the roaster and stuck it in the oven. And so the daughter, when she started hosting Easter, would do the same thing. She'd take the ham, she'd cut both ends off the ham and put it in the roaster, put it in the oven. So finally, the mother turns to the daughter one year and says, "Why are you cutting both ends off the ham?" And she says, "Well, because I saw you do that every year. Isn't that how you're supposed to do it? That's how you cook your ham every year. So I just followed what you were doing." So basically, the answer was, because you've always done it that way, Mom. She says, "Well, I did that because I didn't have a roasting pan big enough for the ham. Your roasting pan has plenty of room. You don't have to do that. Process, right? Why do we do the things we do? So the first thing is, our process is well defined and documented, and not just in somebody's head, right? How many processes in this church are mostly in somebody's head? If it's not written down, we need to start writing it down. You know, I have to admit, you know, my first day in the office, it was really helpful to be able to use Jane's memory all the time, because she knows where everything is. I would have been lost. And so not only are they clearly defined and documented, but are they connected to a clear sense of purpose other than habit? Why do we do communion the way we do it? Okay, well, you know, right? Process capacity. Okay, so the second one is people capacity, right? That's the second one. So basically that comes to, what can our people do? Are we aligned together around God's purpose, or are we just doing our own thing? Do we have our own little kingdoms? Okay, this is my classroom and nobody else can touch it. Right? Do we trust each other? Are we available to one another and to the work of ministry? Are we teachable, or do we know it all already, right? There are plenty of, and one of the things I've noticed around here is everybody really has a desire to learn. I've been in congregations where they basically say, hey, we think we know it all already. So, no thank you. But this congregation, I mean, people are really interested in studying the Bible and learning more. So but are we teachable? Are we really willing to listen and learn from one another? Leadership capacity. Are our leaders personally prepared for God to move? Are we personally ready for God to do something in us? So there's something I learned about leadership, and I tell it to some of my coaching clients in business, is that the moment you become a leader, you discover you end up working more on yourself than on the people you supervise. How many of you have been in those sorts of positions where you've discovered that sort of thing? Yeah. You end up working more on yourself than on the people you supervise. Yes. So are we ready? Are we ready to do that kind of personal preparation for God to move in us? Right? Do our leaders inspire us? Sometimes they make us laugh. Sometimes they make us cry. But do they motivate us to do something together? Or do we just feel like we want to just kind of spin off and do our own thing? Right? Big thing. Can we as leaders admit fault when it's our fault? I mean, if we can admit fault when it's somebody else's fault, that's called blame. Right? And that's really not a leadership thing. That's more of an analysis thing. And a lot of human beings can do that. But real leaders say, okay, this is my piece of it. Can we own our piece of it? Right? We own our piece of it. Do we invite decision input from others? Or is it my way or the highway? Do we have a way to say, hey, what do we want? What do we need? First couple weeks I was here, everybody said, hey, we can't read your slides. I said, oh, I guess I need to up the font size. Hopefully I found something that's workable for everyone. We invite decision input from others. Clear measurement. Are we measuring the right things consistently without measurement becoming an end in itself, right? I mean, so we like to measure stuff that has easy numbers. We had this many people in worship, and we had this many dollars in the offering, and we had this many people in attendance at Awana, and, you know, we like to measure things that are easy to measure. Are we measuring things like, how are people's lives being transformed? How many people's needs are being taken care of? What kind of need, how are we influencing our community? How do we measure those things? We find creative ways of doing that. We had how many shoeboxes filled? Well, what impact does that have on the communities those shoeboxes go to? I think Bobby could probably tell us a whole sermon on that one. Are we measuring the right things? Feedback loops. This is another thing. Are we ready to hear feedback from people that we might not have asked for? Do we know how we are seen in the community among those we serve? If you went to, a gas station in downtown Rantoul, could they tell you where this church was and what the people are like here? How are we seen in the community? Do we know? If we don't know, let's find out. Can't hurt to ask, right? Do we ask them for feedback? Well, how are we doing? When we showed up and did this, how did that feel to you? You guys are the ones that do trunk or treat. Maybe that's how they know us, right? Well, how did that go for you? Did you enjoy it? Was there something we could do better? Do we ask for feedback? And here's the big one. Is the perception of our importance different than others' perception of our importance? And that's one thing that one of the things that I've discovered about churches that I've been a part of is that we know we're doing something important, and somehow the rest of the community hasn't caught on. Right? And so we go, well, don't you think this is important? They say, well, this doesn't really relate to us. So how do we find ways to be relevant? How do we invite the feedback and say, what would really help us is if we had something for young parents who could, leave their kids for a couple hours, get some Bible instructions so their parents could go literally take a nap. Young families, that's sometimes what they need, right? We go, well, how's that ministry? Well, that's still ministry, right? That sort of thing. I guess maybe I'm speaking as a person who just had to share a bed with a 16-month-old while I was away from home for a week. Anyway, nevertheless. And then this thing we call productive disequilibrium. And that's a kind of a crazy term, but we all do it all the time, right? I'm doing it right now. Think about it. If you had to stop mid-stride, what happens? You fall over. Why is that? Because you actually have to be off balance to go forward. Right? You actually have to be off balance to be able to move forward. If you are fully balanced, you're just going to stand still. You actually have to intentionally go a little bit off balance to move forward, side to side, backwards, in any given direction. So the question for us is, are we off balance enough so that we can move forward, but not so far off balance that we just tip over and fall? Or do we prefer to be perfectly balanced and just stand still and do absolutely nothing? Productive disequilibrium. It's that way of how do we get off balance enough to go forward and not just lean over like some sort of strange fountain statue in a garden someplace. Now, of course, then our financial capacity. Do we have access to the resources we need? Looking at the budget, my guess is yes. Do we have a financial process that can sustain an emergency, such as a key person not being available any longer? That's something we want to potentially just check on, those sorts of things, on all of those key places. And can we grow the funds we have to do ministry so we can do more in our community and impact more people? It's our financial capacity. So for this week, as we think about what God has for us, let's be prepared in those two different ways. Oops, the font did not respond to this one. I can hardly see that. So, hey, let's remember, things can be difficult, right? That's what Jesus says. And Jesus invites us to prepare for that difficulty. And God will save us. That's His promise. We don't have to do it all ourselves. We can invite God into helping us. So our next steps. Which areas do you want to focus on personally? Which is the most important to you? What's difficult right now? Think about what's difficult for you right now. How can we serve one another in those areas of difficulty? And how can we focus on what God does with us to prepare us for what He's up to? How do we focus on what God does with us to prepare for what He's up to? Those are our next steps. What's God up to with us? What's difficult? What seems the most important to you out of all those things? As we go to prayer and prepare for communion, I know that the singers are going to come forward. We're going to do another song. But let's invite God to intervene in those places of difficulty and help us to stay the course as we expect Him to move on our behalf. Father God, we thank you that you have promised that no matter how difficult things get, you are with us, and you are coming to save us. We thank you that no matter what, you will give us the strength to persevere, no matter how long it takes for the Son of Man to return. Be with us, Father, as we are preparing for new ministry, for a new year, and for a new crop of leaders. Help us to focus on what you have for us. We thank you, Father, in Jesus' name. Amen.